But at the end of the day, it is a discovery process and a personal process that you're going to need to go through for yourselves. Okay, so the creation of my real self. Number one thing to remember. I am the pinnacle of God's creation. So we want to see, so the point of this section is really this, like, what has God done to create my real self? And I am the pinnacle of God's creation. And most of you, I've said that many times before, right, to you. Most of you don't know what that means yet at all. Let me give you some examples of what it means. Your soul is more complex than the universe itself. And the only things that are almost just as complicated as your soul is the laws that govern it. Right? So the laws that govern it are a complex set of laws that eventually you'll discover as through your own engagement of the process of engaging and coming to know your real self, you'll eventually discover these things about yourself. That you are the most complicated being in the universe. Right? And that applies to us collectively and individually. Interesting thought, hey? That we actually are more complex than the universe itself. And in some ways you can see it if you examine the human body as a sort of type, or a what would you call it? There's a word for that, isn't there? But I can't remember it for the moment. This English language thing is getting me a bit. But it's like your physical body is like an example of the complexity of your soul in some ways, because your physical body is one of the most complex organisms physically, right? And in fact, of all the organisms that humankind examine, the human organism, the actual physical body, is still the least understood compared to the rest of the organisms that we examine. And you can see then, if our human body is the least understood, then what about the spirit body? That must also be the least understood organism in the spirit world, right? And the reality is our soul, which governs those two bodies, is even more complicated again and complex again. So let's look at some basics about its complexity, and that's all we're really going to be able to do at this stage, right? But it's important for you to understand that as the pinnacle of God's creation, you are the most complex thing in the universe, and there's a whole set of complex laws that you can understand once you connect to your soul that govern the development and continuation and the very survival of the human soul. And not only its development and survival, but also its transformation. The human soul is the only organism that God has created that can be transformed from its current created condition into a divine condition. And there's a whole set of laws that govern the transformation of the human soul from the physical condition it's created in its first instance, and the transformation into the divine condition. And even involved in the potentiality of that occurring is an incredible potentiality that's been offered. So a very, very complicated and complex organism, the human soul. So let's examine our human soul, the soul itself. I've drawn these things before. So here we are, we've got our soul, and perhaps the way I could draw it is like this in the beginning, but the trouble is you can't see that, so I'll have to just expand that up to this. So remembering that when it's first created, it's at its most tiniest of states. And its growth is dependent upon a number of things. So just like a baby, when it's first created, it begins in the cell. As soon as the two cells merge, in that split cell state, That's its smallest time, right? But it still exists. And it's a similar thing with the human soul, that the human soul is created in a similar way, and then expansion can occur. But let's say it's this large, right? And it has characteristics and qualities, but basically it has two halves. We've talked about the split of the two halves in a sense, but the reality is the two halves actually don't split. Now, I've talked about it with you as splitting because you need to grasp it in terms of what's happening in the incarnation process. But the reality is, from God's perspective, the two halves are still together. They're not in a unified state yet, but they are together. They are joined together energetically. So you can think of it as joined together as an energy joining them together. Now remember, this soul also, we draw it like this, only because for many of you, you came from a background of New Age philosophy and so forth, and you recognise that symbol as sort of like a yin-yang, sort of something related to the soul. But the reality is, of course, it doesn't look like that. You know? And I think most of you are probably aware that it doesn't. And in fact, it's not even a three-dimensional form. Its dimensional states change into different dimensional states. And so as it grows, its complexity also grows, and what it looks like grows. And the reality is you won't see these souls until you are in the soul union state yourself. Now, the soul union state is defined as this state where both halves are in a completely aware state with each other and an aware state in their relationship with God, and they've gone through a whole series of processes, received God's love in order to become unified. And in fact, it's impossible for the soul union state to occur without receiving God's love. But the soul energetically is still joined together. So here we are in this state, we're joined with the other half. And then we have to become somehow, and in this state, of course, we're unaware, we don't know who we are yet or any of those things. And a process has to be engaged in order for us to become aware. When we become to the process that God designed to become aware is the process called incarnation. And basically the process of incarnation is that two bodies are created by the commingling of the parental cells through the sexual act. The two bodies are created at that point in time. Both bodies also in a undeveloped state. Just a double cell initially, and then they replicate. There's a genetic structure in those cells that determine how everything replicates and how everything grows. And you can imagine then, can't you, that the soul itself must have some kind of similar thing where it has a genetic structure that means that as it grows, it can replicate and change, but the structure is built inside of the soul itself. So the laws, this is the incredible thing about what God's created, is the laws themselves. There's external laws, and then there's laws that are written in the actual genetic structure. So in the genetic structure of the body, the cell structure contains the DNA, which basically are the laws that govern its replication. All right? The same applies to the spirit body, and you would have to assume then, wouldn't you not, that it's probably very similar for the soul. That as it grows and changes, and as it receives divine love, how it changes depends upon some laws that are built inside of the soul itself as a part of its structure, but also that are affected by outside events and circumstances, outside laws. Right? So here we have our soul, most complicated creation, and of course, then once it incarnates, it needs these two bodies, and I'll draw it as a male-female split in this case, just like so. So it needs these two bodies in order for the half of the soul that's unaware of the other half to learn. So spirit body is required, physical body is required. These bodies are both created at the time of conception, And from the moment of conception, the soul can be said to have incarnated and individualized. From that moment on, even though it's still in a state where its awareness is right, the moment before that state, it had no awareness at all of itself. It had instinctual things that are built into the soul itself that requires certain things to activate. And once those particular things occur, those events activate the soul and also its ability to connect to the bodies and so forth, and away that process goes. So the incarnation process requires this process to occur before individualization is complete. So you could say that the individualization process begins at the time of the first half of the soul being conceived, and the individualization process ends at the time the second half of the soul is conceived. Right? Now it's individualized. The job of individualization is complete. The soul, of course, in that state is still very, very undeveloped. So it's like I said, a little tiny cell. It's just in the process of starting its own development. Right? But connected to these bodies, which are also in the conception phase, just a little tiny cell. And then slowly awareness develops. Yeah? Okay. So there's our soul. Now, there's some things that we need to be aware of. There is energetic connection between the two halves of the soul. You are not this, you can't say that this person is I. That's not true. This is I. Right? All the laws that apply to the soul apply to the whole soul, not just to its half. So the I is you and the other half of you. That's I. Most of you don't believe that at this stage, and in fact you're completely unaware of that. And so what that does, your lack of awareness does, is it does this to you. It creates barriers internally between the two halves of the soul, which is why I've been drawing them like this. Right? The lack of awareness, and we're talking now about soul-based emotional awareness, so it makes no difference what I tell you intellectually at all. Right? What happens is there's got to be something that changes emotionally before this awareness process begins, the reconnection, if you like. But the reality is, from God's perspective, you're already connected to the other half. You're just unaware of it. And in fact, for many of you, you want to be unaware of it. In fact, for many of you, you'll want to be and continue unaware of it for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. Just depends on your will and how you exercise your will to be unaware. So what you've done is you've created an I and another I and called them separate persons, separate beings. That's what you've done. Now, you imagine if our parents hadn't had this separation between the genders, or this desire to just be I based upon no connection with the other half. Well, it's very likely then, as children, that we'd grow up believing there is our other half somewhere as a part of us that we become aware of quite rapidly, which is what happened for myself in the first century, actually. I was aware that there was the other half of myself from a very, very young age, because I didn't have the injury at the time of the lack of awareness. The emotional barriers that caused me to not be aware did not exist. Does that make sense? And it wasn't because of me, it was because God chose to remove them, because if God didn't choose to remove them, nobody in the end would have learnt it. So he had to do something to make it change so we could become aware. So there's the I. The I is not you, not I. Is it all getting complicated already? The I is two of you, one as one. That's I. Yeah. You can see that any feelings of self-determination regarding the I just being me, AJ rather than myself and Mary, Jesus rather than Mary and Jesus, any self-determination has to be caused by emotional injury. And it is caused by emotional injury. And a lack of awareness. So, lack of personal awareness. So, Amber, you'd like to ask?